Welcome to Twist of Revenge, where we don't just tell stories, we unearth the heartbeats beneath them. If stories of family, redemption, and the invisible threads that connect us speak to your soul, I invite you to subscribe. Because some of the most powerful stories aren't found in headlines. They live quietly inside the people we think we know best. Today's story is called, I Used to Hate My Dad for Being a Cop, but after he died, I finally understood his worth. Let's begin with Chapter 1. Chapter 1, the things we inherit without choosing. There are things we inherit without asking for them. The shape of our jawline, the curve of a frown, the silence at dinner, and sometimes a last name that carries a history we never agreed to. My name is Noah Reeves. I'm 28 years old now, but this story begins long before that, back when I was 14, full of anger I didn't understand, and convinced my father was the reason I felt hollow inside. He was a cop, not just a cop, a by-the-book, old-school, straight-backed officer who ironed his shirts with military precision and smelled faintly of coffee and gun oil. He wore his badge like a second skin. And he believed in rules, so many rules, most of them unspoken. We lived in a two-story house in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. Nothing remarkable except for how quiet it was, especially when he was home. There's a strange loneliness that comes from growing up in the same house as someone you don't know how to talk to. My mom used to say, "Your father loves you in his own way." But his own way felt a lot like absence. His dinners were brief. His questions procedural. How's school? You staying out of trouble? His hugs rare and awkward, like a handshake that got lost halfway. I remember once, I must have been 9, I scraped my knee riding my bike. I came inside crying, bleeding, hoping for comfort. My mom wrapped me in a towel and kissed my forehead. My dad just nodded and said, "Toughen up. The world won't go easy on you." At school, the kids joked about cops being pigs. Some meant it, some didn't. I laughed along, pretending it didn't matter that my dad was one, pretending I wasn't embarrassed by the black and white patrol car parked in our driveway, pretending I didn't flinch every time someone asked, "Wait, your dad's a cop." I wanted him to be a teacher, or a mechanic, or something boring, something safe, something normal. Instead, I got a man who missed my baseball games, came home smelling like sweat and tension, and told stories he never finished. Guy pulled a knife today. And then silence, or worse. You wouldn't understand. He was right. I didn't. And over time, that gap between us widened into something neither of us dared to cross. I tell you all this not to make you pity me or hate him, but because stories, the real ones, are built on what we don't say, and this silence between us was the foundation of everything that came after. I used to think my father chose his job over me. Now I wonder if he chose it for me. But back then, I hated it. I hated the badge. I hated the uniform. And truth be told, I hated him. Not because of what he did, but because I didn't understand who he was. And sometimes when you're young, not understanding someone feels a lot like being unloved by them. That was the beginning. Next time I'll tell you about the night I told him I wished he weren't my father and how he didn't say a word back. He just stood there and walked away. But not before I saw it, the first crack in the armor. Open book chapter 2, the night I told him I wished he weren't my dad. The night it happened, there was a storm. Not outside, the skies were clear. But in our house, lightning had found its own way in. It started with a knock at the door, sharp, fast, impatient. My father had just gotten home, still in uniform, his belt still heavy with gear. I was 16 and full of the kind of fury that can only come from being invisible too long. He looked tired. I didn't care. The knock came again. He opened the door and there stood Mrs. Fletcher, our neighbor from 3 houses down. Pale, frantic, her hands trembling. "They're shouting across the street," she said. "It sounds bad, like real bad." My father didn't say a word. He just stepped out, grabbed his radio and jogged into the darkness. He didn't even look at me. He didn't ask if I wanted to come. Didn't say, "Stay here, son." Didn't ask if I was okay. Just left. And somehow that small, silent departure snapped something in me. When he came back an hour later, the adrenaline still clung to his skin. I was sitting at the kitchen table, arms crossed, waiting. The clock blinked 10:46 p.m. in red. "What happened?" I asked, voice flat. "Just a domestic dispute," he said, rinsing his hands in the sink. "It's handled now." "Was someone hurt?" He looked at me, then looked away. "It's fine, Noah, you don't need to know everything." And there it was again, that wall, that damned wall. "Of course not," I muttered. "I'm just your kid, why would I need to know anything?" He dried his hands, turned to me slowly. "Watch your tone." I stood up. "You ever wonder why we don't talk?" He blinked once. "Excuse me. You don't even see me, Dad. You come home, eat in silence, fall asleep on the couch. You miss every game, every performance, every parent-teacher conference. And then when you're actually here, you're, what? A robot. That's enough." "No, it's not. You don't get to bark orders like I'm some rookie on your squad. I'm your son, Dad, and I wish." I hesitated. I should have stopped there, but pain has its own gravity, and once you get pulled in, there's no soft landing. "I wish you weren't my father." The words hung in the air, sharp and cold like broken glass. He didn't yell. He didn't even flinch. He just stared at me, this long, quiet stare, like he was trying to see through me past the anger into something smaller and older and sadder. And then, without saying a word, he turned around and walked out of the room. I waited for the door to slam. It didn't. I waited for footsteps stomping up the stairs. There were none. I sat back down, suddenly aware of how loud the fridge was humming, how hollow the house sounded without him in it, and I hated myself for not feeling triumphant, because that was supposed to be my victory, right? Telling off the man who never listened, calling him out for a decade of emotional absence. But all I felt was a quiet ache, and for the first time a question I had never let myself ask began to form. What if he was doing his best? I didn't know how to answer it then. I wasn't ready to. Instead, I poured a glass of water, sat in the silence he left behind, and tried to convince myself I had won something. But deep down, I knew I'd just drawn the first wound in a war that neither of us truly wanted. And worse, I'd made it personal. I didn't see him for the next 2 days. He worked double shifts, or maybe he just didn't want to come home. Either way, the house felt colder, not because he wasn't there, but because for the first time, I wasn't sure he ever would be, not fully, not as my father. And that somehow hurt more than his absence ever had. Open book chapter 3, The Silence That Didn't Heal. After the night I told my father I wished he weren't mine, the house changed. Not visibly, the walls still held their framed photographs, the kitchen still smelled faintly of burnt toast and lemon-scented cleaner. My mother still hummed when she folded laundry, but underneath it all something essential had shifted. The silence wasn't new, but now it felt intentional. I didn't apologize, neither did he. We circled each other like ghosts, passing in the hallway, never touching, never speaking unless absolutely necessary. Dinner's in the oven. Don't forget your shift at the library. Trash goes out Tuesday. Sentences became transactions. And while I should have felt powerful, like I had finally put him in his place, the truth is, the distance started to feel like abandonment all over again. He never brought it up. Not that night. Not the next week. Not even when my birthday came and went, marked only by a quiet card with his signature in stiff handwriting. Dad, no message, no I'm proud of you, not even a love you, just his name like a witness signing off a report. I kept the card anyway. I told myself I didn't care. Told my friends he was just a cop, nothing more. Laughed when they joked about power-hungry officers or donut cliches, but every time I saw him in uniform, something twisted in my chest, a tangle of resentment and longing I couldn't untie. One afternoon, I came home to find his service belt on the kitchen table. It was the first time I'd seen it up close. I remember running my fingers along the leather, feeling the weight of the handcuffs, the cold outline of the holster, the pepper spray canister. All those years I'd seen him wear it like armor. Now, stripped of his body, it looked heavy, not just physically, emotionally. I tried to picture him walking into people's worst moments, domestic fights, break-ins, overdoses, suicide calls, and I realized I had no idea what his days were like, what he saw, what he carried, what he buried before coming home and sitting in front of the television like nothing had happened. And yet I still felt cheated, because even if his job was hard, he had chosen it. He chose the badge. I didn't choose the distance. I didn't choose to be the son of a man who never said, "I love you," who treated dinner conversations like shift reports, who looked more comfortable interrogating suspects than talking to his own kid. One night, I heard my mother and him arguing in their bedroom. I was brushing my teeth. Their voices were muffled, but I caught pieces. "He's your son, Richard. You think I don't know that? Then why won't you talk to him? Because every time I do, he looks at me like I'm the enemy." The word hit harder than I expected. Enemy. Was that what we were now? Me, the teenage rebel with hurt feelings and loud accusations. Him, the stoic officer who never learned how to be vulnerable without a badge to hide behind. I went to bed that night thinking of all the things we never said, the jokes we never shared, the advice he never gave, the father-son moments we missed while standing on opposite shores of the same grief. And I wondered, not for the last time, what if one day he didn't come home? What if I had already used my last words on him and they were full of hate? But I didn't tell him that. Didn't knock on his door, didn't write a note. I did what I always did. I kept it in, let it sink, let it harden, and the silence between us grew roots. Open book chapter 4, when the world gave me permission to hate him. It started with a video, shaky, blurry, cell phone footage shot from across a street. A police officer, tall, broad-shouldered, yelling commands at a man on a sidewalk. The man had his hands up. He was shouting too, scared or angry, maybe both. Then it happened, a scuffle, a flash of movement, and the officer tackled him to the ground. The clip cut off before the full context ever showed up. But the headlines didn't wait. Excessive force. Another cop crosses the line. How many more? By that evening it was everywhere. CNN, Twitter. My classmates' Instagram stories. People didn't need the full story, they had already picked their side. So had I. Even though the man in the video wasn't my father. Even though the incident happened 3 states away. Even though I knew every case was more complicated than 10 seconds of blurry footage. I didn't care. Because now I had something I hadn't had before, public permission to be angry. The world was finally validating the resentment I'd carried quietly for years. The uniform, the badge, the silences, the discipline, none of it looked noble anymore. It looked oppressive, outdated, even cruel. Kids at school started making jokes in front of me, then catching themselves. "Oh, sorry, Noah, forgot your dad's a cop." I'd laugh it off. No big deal, he's barely around anyway. And it wasn't a lie, he wasn't around. And when he was, it felt like he was trying harder to be a model officer than a present father. That week during history class, we had a heated debate about law enforcement and community trust. One girl raised her hand and said, "The whole system's broken. Cops protect their own, not people." I didn't argue. I didn't defend him. I sat there silent and complicit, and part of me felt relieved, because finally I could blame him not just for my personal wounds, but for something bigger. He wasn't just a distant father. He was part of a broken machine. He represented everything I didn't want to become. That night I came home late. My father was at the kitchen table, reading a report. His gun was on the counter, unloaded but still jarring. The news was playing softly in the background, the same footage, the same outrage. He turned the volume down when I walked in. "You okay?" he asked. I shrugged. "Sure, why wouldn't I be?" He looked at me for a beat too long. "Rough week," he said. I dropped my backpack, opened the fridge. "Depends on your definition of rough." He didn't answer, just returned to his paperwork. I stared at him, the lines on his forehead, the veins in his hands, the weary slump of his shoulders. And I wondered, for the first time, what it must feel like to be hated for the thing you think defines your worth. But I didn't ask, because even if I had, he wouldn't have answered. He would have just said something like, "We don't do this job to be liked." And maybe that was the problem. Maybe I just wanted him to try to explain, try to connect, try to make me feel like I wasn't just another report he was filing at the end of a long day. Instead, he reached for the remote and turned off the TV. The room went silent. "You know," he said quietly, "sometimes people see what they want to see." I didn't respond, because I didn't know if he was talking about the video or me. Open book chapter 5. The chair beside me was empty. There's a moment in every teenager's life where they secretly hope, even if they never admit it, that their parent will finally show up. Not just physically, but truly show up. To see them, to be proud, to clap just a little too loud in the audience. For me, that moment was senior night. Varsity basketball, final home game, my name printed on the program, my jersey freshly pressed, and one folding chair on the court with a name taped to the back, Dad. I had told him a week earlier, even circled the date on the fridge with red marker. He had nodded, unreadable as always. "I'll try to make it." I hated that phrase, "I'll try to make it," as if showing up for your kid was a favor, as if being a father was negotiable. The night arrived. The gym was buzzing. Parents carried flowers and homemade posters. Every teammate had someone there, a mom, a dad, a whole squad of cheering relatives. They lined up beside us during player introductions, beaming like we were walking into the NBA. I stood there alone. The announcer called my name. Number 11, Noah Reeves. Applause erupted. I smiled politely. The chair beside me was still empty. My coach gave me a gentle pat on the back. The assistant coach stepped into the photo with me, holding the bouquet the school had provided for my guest. A few parents in the bleachers looked around awkwardly. I kept my face straight. I'd practiced this expression for years, the half smile that said, "It's fine, I'm used to it." But inside, something sank. It wasn't the first time he hadn't shown up. But this time it felt final. After the game, which we won, by the way, and I played the best I had all season, I found Mom waiting for me near the locker rooms. She had a card, a small balloon, a hug that lasted a second too long. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "Thanks," I said, still sweaty, still breathless. He got called in, she added softly like it would make a difference. There was a situation downtown. He said he's sorry. I didn't answer, because I knew he'd say that even if there hadn't been a situation. That night, I threw the bouquet in the trash behind the school. When I got home, his car was in the driveway. Inside, the TV was on. He was on the couch, still in uniform, his eyes closed but not quite asleep. He opened them as I walked in. "How was the game?" he asked. I took a long look at him, at the man who had sworn to protect strangers at all costs but couldn't find time for his own son. "We won," I said. "That's great." He nodded. "Really great." I turned away. "Hey," he added as I reached the stairs. "I'm proud of you." I paused just for a second, and then I kept walking. Because by then those words had come too late, and I didn't trust them anymore. Open book chapter 6, leaving without really leaving. I left home 2 months after graduation. No big scene, no yelling, no shattered picture frames or slammed doors, just a single suitcase, a duffel bag, and a note on the kitchen counter that read, "I got the place near campus. I'll figure things out." Noah. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't give him the chance to stop me, not that I believed he would. Mom cried, of course. She folded a 20 into my palm when she hugged me like it was still a school field trip and not the first page of a new life. He wasn't home when I left. He was working late, or maybe just staying out longer than usual. It didn't matter. The apartment I moved into had thin walls, peeling paint, and a broken heater that coughed through the night like it was dying. But it was mine. And more importantly, it was his absence I was renting, not just the space. I told myself this was freedom. That distance was a cure. And for a while, it almost was. I filled my days with lectures, coffee shops, cheap takeout, and textbooks so heavy they left red dents on my collarbones. I made friends who didn't know my father, didn't care what he did, and when someone asked what my parents did for a living, I'd say, "My mom's a nurse, my dad works in public service." Vague, safe, easy to swallow. I avoided coming home on long weekends. Found excuses over Thanksgiving. Even Christmas, I only stayed a day or two, enough to keep my mother from worrying, but not long enough for conversation to start between me and him. He'd ask how school was. I'd answer in one word. Then he'd go silent again, and we'd sit at the same table, eating the same food, pretending we weren't strangers. What surprised me most wasn't how easy it was to drift apart. It was how natural it felt. There was no fight to fix things, just a quiet agreement to stop trying. But the strange thing about leaving home is, you take pieces of it with you, even the ones you hate. In my second semester, I started waking up at 5:45 a.m. without setting an alarm, same time he used to leave for work. My roommate thought I was insane. "You training for a marathon or something?" I shrugged. "No idea, habit, I guess." And when I walked past a police cruiser downtown, I'd tense, not out of fear but out of recognition. I'd glance at the officer inside, half expecting to see him. Of course, I never did. But something in my chest would pull anyway, like a muscle remembering an old injury. In my third semester, I saw a protest near campus. "Justice for all," the signs read. "Accountability now." A speaker stood on the steps of the administration building, shouting into a megaphone about police brutality, broken systems, and blood in the streets. I stood in the back of the crowd, hands deep in my hoodie, unsure what I felt. Part of me agreed with everything he said. Another part wondered if anyone there knew a man who'd come home with bruised ribs and never complained. A man who never raised his voice, even when his son told him he wished he weren't his father. I didn't stay long, just long enough to feel guilty for leaving and guilty for wanting to leave. I didn't call him on his birthday, didn't text, didn't send a card, and when mine came there was an envelope in the mail. No return address, but I knew the handwriting. Inside was a check for $100 and a note that read, "Heard tuition went up. Hope this helps." No love, Dad, no apology, no question. Just the same man, trying to help without knowing how to reach me. I kept the check, never cashed it. I didn't need the money, I just needed to know he still cared, I guess. Even if I wasn't ready to forgive him, even if I still believed he'd chosen his job over me. It would be another year before I saw him again, and by then everything would be different. But I didn't know that yet. I only knew how to leave, not how to come back. Open book chapter 7, the uniform that followed me. It was mid-April when the city caught fire, not with flames but with fury. It began with a name. One you didn't need to know last week but now couldn't forget. A man, unarmed, pinned beneath the weight of a knee in silence. The footage was 8 minutes long and somehow not nearly enough to explain the heartbreak. We watched it in the student union. 20 or 30 of us, hunched over phones and laptops, staring into a screen like it might blink and end differently this time. But it didn't. The man didn't get up, and the officer didn't move. Someone whispered, "How the hell do you justify that?" Someone else said, "They're all the same." And I stood there frozen because they meant him. And I didn't know how to defend a man I hadn't spoken to in almost a year. That night, campus swelled with protest. Students poured into the street with cardboard signs, chants, grief and anger. Helicopters thundered overhead. Police formed lines across intersections, stiff in their riot gear like statues of fear. And between their faces and ours, an invisible war exploded, one that had nothing and everything to do with me. I didn't march, I watched. On the curb, hoodie up, hands in my pockets, feeling like I belonged to neither side. People shouted at the officers. Officers shouted back. Someone threw a bottle. Someone got tackled. And somewhere in the smoke, I saw a man, maybe 50, maybe older, standing still, his hand hovering near his badge. For a split second, I thought it was him. It wasn't, but I couldn't unsee it. That night I went home and stood in front of the bathroom mirror for 20 minutes, not brushing my teeth, not fixing my hair, just staring, trying to find his face in mine. I hated how easy it was. A week later in my ethics class we were assigned a short reflection. Write about how power intersects with identity. Some students wrote about gender, some wrote about race. I wrote about the uniform, how a badge could give someone a voice or take one away. How a father could protect people he'd never met and still leave his son unprotected from silence. The professor called it raw, unresolved, and deeply personal. She was right, but she didn't know the half of it. Later that week, someone spray-painted across the wall of a bank downtown, "Cops equals killers." It made the news. People cheered. Others raged. And all I could think about was the coat closet in our old house, where his uniform still hung, pressed, polished, waiting. I remembered how he used to polish his badge every Sunday morning like it was sacred. How he'd say to my mom, "If I don't respect the uniform, how can I expect anyone else to?" And now that same badge was being burned in effigy. Mocked. Despised. It wasn't just his reputation being questioned anymore. It was my identity too. I didn't tell anyone my father was a cop. I hadn't in years. But now it wasn't just shame, it was fear. What if someone found out? Would they look at me differently? Would they lump me into the same system they were trying to tear down? One afternoon, while walking back from the library, I saw a police cruiser parked by the curb, officer inside, sipping bad coffee, bored out of his mind. And I stared for far too long, because part of me wanted him to roll down the window and say, "Everything okay, son?" And part of me wanted to scream, "Do you even know what you represent?" Instead, I just kept walking. But in my head, a question echoed over and over. If he was still proud to wear that badge, was I still proud to carry his name? Open Book Chapter 8, the last thing I ever said to him. I didn't plan to go home that weekend. I had an assignment due, a shift at the cafe, and a dozen excuses lined up like soldiers. But Mom texted, "Dad's birthday dinner, just us. No pressure, come if you can." I don't know what made me say yes. Maybe guilt, maybe routine. Maybe I wanted to see if he even cared whether I came. He didn't text, didn't call, didn't say thank you when I walked in the door that Friday evening with a six-pack of root beer, his favorite apparently. The house hadn't changed. Same beige walls, same dusty photo frames. Same tightness in the air when he was in the room. Dinner was meatloaf, the same one Mom had made 100 times. She tried to keep things light. Asked about school, about work. I gave her half smiles, short answers. He barely looked up from his plate. About halfway through the meal, I asked flatly, "So how's work?" He chewed, swallowed, shrugged. "Busy. Must be fun," I muttered. He glanced up. "What's that supposed to mean?" I didn't answer, didn't need to. Mom cleared her throat. "Noah don't know," he said, laying his fork down slowly. "Let's hear it, you clearly have something to say." I leaned back, arms crossed. "What's the point? You won't hear it anyway." He exhaled through his nose. "Try me." "Fine," I snapped. "You want to know what I think? I think you've spent your whole life protecting strangers and ignoring your own family. I think you wear that badge like it's a reason not to be human. And I think," my voice cracked, but I didn't stop, "that it's easier for you to face bullets than face your own son." His jaw tightened. Mom whispered, "Please stop." But I couldn't. "I needed a dad," I said, each word shaking. "Not a cop. Not a lecture, not someone who taught me how to fear silence. And now that the whole world's calling you the bad guy, suddenly I get it." He stood up, not angry, not yelling, just done. He picked up his plate, walked to the sink, and said quietly, like it hurt to say it, "I never asked you to understand. I just hoped you would." And I said, sharper than I meant, colder than I should have, "You don't get to play the victim. Not now, not after all the years you disappeared in front of me." He turned slowly. There was something in his eyes I hadn't seen in a long time. Not rage, not disappointment, grief, not for himself, for me, like he saw how broken I was and blamed himself for building me that way. But instead of saying any of that, he nodded once. "Okay, that's all. Just okay." And then he walked upstairs. The stairs creaked the same way they always had. But this time, each step sounded like a door closing. I left before sunrise, didn't say goodbye, didn't leave a note. I drove back to campus with the radio off and the windows down, trying to breathe something, anything that didn't feel like regret. And somewhere along the highway, I remember thinking, that was the last time I'll ever speak to him. But I didn't know yet how right I was. Open Book Chapter 9, the call that changed everything. It was a Tuesday. I remember because I had an economics exam at 8 a.m. and I hadn't studied for it. I woke up late, spilled coffee on my notes, and ran 3 red lights on the way to campus. Typical chaos, typical noise. I was halfway through the test, stomach churning, hand cramping, when my phone buzzed in my backpack. Once, then again and again. I ignored it until it didn't stop. The professor shot me a look as I fished it out under the desk. 3 missed calls, Mom. 1 missed call, unknown number. Voicemail, Noah, call me now. My chest tightened before I even hit play. There are some things the body knows before the brain can explain them. The kind of knowing that drops into your stomach like a stone, heavy, cold, unmoving. I stepped into the hallway, heart already sprinting ahead of me. When Mom picked up, she didn't say hello, she just breathed. And then, voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Your father's gone." Everything slowed, not like in movies, where time freezes and the music swells, but slower than that, quieter. I leaned against the wall. "What do you mean gone?" There was a robbery, a convenience store on the west side. He was the first on the scene. The guy had a gun. There was a hostage, a little boy. Her voice cracked. He got them out, but he didn't make it. I didn't speak, because part of me still thought this was a mistake. The wrong person, the wrong father, the wrong ending. But deep down, deeper than thought, I knew. Because that man, for all his faults, had always run into danger when the rest of the world ran away. And of course it ended like this. Of course it did. The last thing I said to him was, "You don't get to play the victim." I drove home that night in silence. No music, no calls, no tears. Just mile after mile of headlights and darkness and the word gone echoing through every bone in my body. When I got there, the house was full of people, officers in dress blues, neighbors. Someone had brought a casserole. Mom was sitting on the couch, small and still, holding his badge in her hands like it might start beating again. I knelt beside her. She didn't look up, just pressed the cold metal into my palm. "He kept it polished," she said, "every Sunday." I nodded, my throat burned. They told us he died saving a child. A 7-year-old boy, locked in the back room when the robber panicked. Dad negotiated, distracted, moved in when the moment opened and shielded the kid with his body. He took 2 bullets to the chest. He was dead before they reached the hospital. That night I sat alone in my childhood bedroom, staring at the uniform still hanging in the closet, pressed, clean, still smelling faintly of his cologne. I remembered every missed game, every silent dinner, every birthday card signed with just his name. And I remembered the look in his eyes the last time we spoke, not angry, not distant, just tired, like a man who knew he couldn't undo what years of silence had built between us. And yet he still showed up. Even in the end, he showed up. Open book chapter 10, the day the town stood still. The morning of the funeral, the sky was gray, not stormy, not clear, just gray, like the weather itself wasn't sure how to feel. The church was full long before the service began. Neighbors, teachers, shop owners, strangers whose names I didn't know but who somehow knew his. Police officers in dress blues lined the pews like sentinels. Their white gloves folded neatly on their laps, their hats pressed flat against their knees. When the casket arrived, draped in the American flag, the whole room went silent. Not just quiet, silent. The kind of silence that carries weight. The kind that presses into your chest until you forget how to breathe. I sat in the front row beside Mom, my hands shaking against my knees. On the other side of me, a police chaplain spoke soft words about duty and sacrifice, but his voice blurred like background noise. My eyes stayed locked on the box in front of me. That box was too small to hold a man I'd spent my whole life fighting against. I stared at the wood, and all I could think was, how can someone who filled so much space leave behind so little? The chief of police stepped up to the pulpit. His voice was firm but cracked around the edges. He told stories I had never heard about my father volunteering for extra patrols when the younger officers were exhausted, about him buying groceries for a widow who couldn't afford them, about how he'd once sat in his cruiser for 3 hours talking a desperate teenager out of jumping off a bridge. People nodded. Some wiped their eyes. I sat there, stunned, because I didn't know any of it. The man they described wasn't the man I grew up with. Or maybe it was. Maybe it was the part of him I'd never been allowed to see. When it was my turn, they asked if I wanted to speak. I shook my head. What could I possibly say? That the last words I gave him were poisoned. That while the whole town called him a hero, his own son had called him absent. That I had waited too long to see him and now it was too late. So I stayed quiet. Outside, after the service, the honor guard lined up. The sharp crack of the 21-gun salute split the air. The folded flag was placed in my mother's hands. She wept into the cloth like it was the only piece of him she had left. When they called his badge number over the radio, Officer Richard Reeves, end of watch, my throat closed. That phrase, end of watch, it sounded final, too final. People came up to me afterward, shaking my hand, saying things like, "Your father was the best man I ever knew," or "You should be proud." And all I could think was, why didn't he show me that man? The uniform had stolen him from me. And yet here it was, the very thing I resented, giving him back in a way I never expected. I drove home that night with his badge in my pocket. It felt heavy, hotter than metal should feel. And for the first time, I wondered if carrying his name might mean more than I ever let myself believe. Open Book Chapter 11, The Things He Never Said. The days after the funeral blurred together. Casserole dishes piled up in our fridge. Sympathy cards stacked on the mantel, each with the same words dressed in different handwriting. He was a hero, he will be missed. I hated the word hero. Not because it wasn't true, but because it felt borrowed, too clean, too shiny. It didn't match the man I grew up with, a man of calloused hands, long silences, and eyes that always seemed elsewhere. One evening, when most of the visitors had gone, a man lingered by the door, middle-aged, with lines that looked carved more by worry than time. He wore no uniform, just a plaid shirt tucked into worn jeans. "You're Noah, right?" he asked. I nodded. He held out his hand. "My name's Daniel. Your father saved my life once." I didn't know what to say. I shook his hand because it was easier than speaking. "It was about 10 years ago," he continued. "I was drunk, really drunk, standing on the edge of the overpass out by Route 6. I thought I was done. But your dad, he just stood there with me, didn't try to pull me down right away. Didn't lecture me, he just listened for an hour until I stopped shaking enough to step back." Daniel's eyes grew glassy. He checked on me for years after that, stopped by the diner where I worked. Never told anyone, never wanted credit, just cared. My chest tightened. I didn't know whether to thank him or cry. After he left, I went to my father's study, a small room I had avoided since coming back. His desk was neat, of course. Papers stacked, pens aligned, a worn leather chair that still carried the faint imprint of his body. In the drawer, beneath tax forms and old bills, I found a notebook. Plain, black, unassuming. When I opened it, my breath caught. It wasn't a diary, not exactly, more like fragments, notes, names, stories. "Mrs. Alvarez, check if her porch light works. She said the dark scares her. Tyrell, 12 years old, loves baseball, father locked up. Try to get him to the youth program. Noah didn't eat much at dinner tonight, quiet, don't know how to reach him. God, I wish I did." I froze at my own name, read it over and over until the words blurred. He had noticed, the silences, the empty plates, the distance. He just hadn't known how to cross it. I closed the book, pressing it to my chest like it might answer every question I had never dared to ask. For the first time since the call, the tears came. Not soft, but shaking, heaving sobs that made me feel both lighter and heavier at once. Because in that moment I realized, maybe he hadn't been absent. Maybe he'd just been speaking a language I never learned how to hear. Open Book Chapter 12, The Stories He Left Behind. A few days after the funeral, I found myself at the precinct. I hadn't planned on going. Crowds still made me nervous, and walking into a building full of uniforms felt like walking into the very thing I'd spent years running from. But Mom asked me to come with her to pick up Dad's things. His locker, his files, his badge, the one they'd already handed her folded in a velvet case, but now they wanted to give us the rest. The halls smelled like coffee and old carpet. Phones rang, typewriters clacked. It felt both ordinary and heavy, like a place where people carried burdens too big to leave at the door. As we waited, officers approached us one by one. Some shook my hand. Some just nodded, their eyes wet, their mouths tight with words they couldn't quite shape. One of them, a younger officer with freckles across his nose, stopped me. "You're Noah, right?" "Yeah." He shifted awkwardly. "Your dad, he talked about you a lot." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the words felt impossible. "Talked about me? What did he say?" "That he was proud," the officer said simply. "Said you were stubborn, smart, too sharp for your own good sometimes." He smiled faintly. "He said you reminded him of himself when he was young." I didn't know what to do with that. Pride had never been a language we shared. Another officer, older this time, with gray stubble and weary eyes, pulled me aside near the vending machines. "I rode with your dad for years. He never backed down, not once. But more than that, he had this way of seeing people." "What do you mean?" I asked. He took a sip of his coffee, his hand trembling slightly. "Most guys, they see troublemakers, criminals, statistics. Your dad, he saw people. Even when they screwed up, even when they lied. He'd ask questions others didn't bother with. What's your name? Who's waiting for you at home? He treated people like they mattered, even when they were at their worst. I swallowed hard. He once told me, the officer continued, if I can walk away leaving someone with a little more dignity than they had when I arrived, then I've done my job. The words sank into me like stones. Dignity. It wasn't something I ever associated with him. Not at home, not with me. But maybe that was because he spent it all outside, on strangers, on people who needed it more than he thought I did. When we finally gathered his belongings, the locker felt like an X-ray of his life. Polished shoes, extra notebooks filled with the same scrawled fragments I'd found in his desk. A photo of me at age 10, holding a baseball bat taped inside the door. I stared at it, fingers trembling. I couldn't remember him taking that picture, couldn't remember him even being at that game. And yet there it was, proof that somehow in the quiet margins of his life he had carried me with him. On the way out, the chief stopped me. His voice was low, steady, the kind of voice you listen to whether you want to or not. "Your father was one of the good ones, Noah. Don't ever let the noise out there convince you otherwise." I nodded but didn't answer, because deep down I knew the noise he spoke of wasn't just the world outside. It was the echo of my own words, the last ones I'd ever said to him. Open Book Chapter 13, The Language I Never Learned. Nights were the hardest. The house felt different without him, but not in the way I expected. It wasn't just emptiness, it was presence. A ghost that lived in the rhythm of the floorboards, the smell of leather and soap, the drawer that still stuck halfway when you pulled it too fast. I found myself back in his study, the little room with its worn desk and crooked blinds. The notebook I had discovered earlier still sat there. I picked it up again, this time with less fear. I read slowly, page by page. Traffic stop. Woman with 3 kids in the car. Gave her a warning, not a ticket. She said she couldn't afford milk if I find her. Teenager caught shoplifting. Bought him lunch. Told him one mistake doesn't define you. Noah's science project on the counter. Forgot to ask him about it. Need to remember next time. My eyes caught on that line. Need to remember next time. I tried to recall if he ever had asked me. If he'd said anything about the crooked little volcano I built out of cardboard and glue. I couldn't remember. Maybe he hadn't. Maybe he had and I was too stubborn to hear it. The more I read, the more I realized his life was full of half-sentences like that, gestures that never reached their destination. He wasn't absent. He was unfinished, and maybe so was I. In the back of the notebook, I found a prayer scribbled in messy ink. God, help me protect them, even when they don't see me, especially when they don't want me. Keep Noah safe. Let him know I tried. I pressed the page with my palm until the paper softened with sweat. He had been speaking this whole time, just not in words I knew how to hear. His language was duty. His grammar, sacrifice. His love letter was the badge I resented, the long hours, the bent shoulders. And I, fluent only in want, in absence, in anger, never understood it. I closed the notebook and sat in the stillness of that room, the late afternoon light cutting through the blinds like stripes across the carpet. For the first time, I whispered to the silence, "I heard you, Dad. I hear you now." The words cracked in my throat, but they felt like the start of something, not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe a translation. Open book chapter 14, seeing through his eyes. It happened slowly, almost without me noticing. At first, it was just small things. I'd be walking across campus and see a man shouting on a street corner, the kind of person I used to cross the street to avoid, and instead of hurrying past, I'd hear my father's voice in my head. People show you their worst when no one else has ever seen their best. I found myself stopping, listening, offering $1 or directions, or sometimes just a nod that said, "I see you." One evening at the cafe where I worked, a kid about 15 came in with a crumpled dollar bill and asked if it was enough for a sandwich. My instinct was to say no, it wasn't, but something inside me shifted. I covered the rest myself. "Don't worry about it," I said. The way his face lit up, it startled me. It was the same look I must have worn once, though I couldn't remember when. Later, I thought about that entry in Dad's notebook. Teenager caught shoplifting, bought him lunch, told him one mistake doesn't define you. And for the first time, I didn't just read the words, I understood them. I began volunteering at a youth center near campus, tutoring kids who reminded me too much of myself, restless, angry, looking for someone to blame. One boy, Marcus, sat across from me with his arms crossed, daring me to prove I cared. "You don't get it," he said. "My dad's never around." I swallowed hard. "You're right," I said. "I don't get your exact story, but I know what it's like to want more from a dad than you think you'll ever get." He stared at me, suspicious. Then slowly his shoulders dropped. Something softened between us. And in that moment, I felt my father's presence more clearly than I had at the funeral, at the house, or even in his notebooks. Not as a ghost haunting me, but as a compass guiding me. I kept his badge on my desk, not to worship it, not to pretend I had suddenly reconciled every wound, but because it reminded me of something I had learned too late. Love isn't always loud. Sometimes it's silent. Sometimes it's hidden. Sometimes it's carried like a shield, heavy and unspoken. And now, every time I looked at that badge, I asked myself a question I'd never asked before. How do I live in a way that would make him proud, not of the officer he was, but of the son I'm becoming? Open book chapter 15, carrying the torch my way. I never put on his uniform. That was never the point. The world already had enough officers, enough rules, enough walls between people. What I needed was a way to bridge those walls. So I started small. At first, It was just tutoring at the youth center, then organizing a weekend basketball game for the kids who hung around outside with nothing better to do. We borrowed a dusty gym, dragged out old hoops, and for 2 hours every Saturday, those kids laughed louder than they fought. One afternoon, a boy named Tyrese pulled me aside. He was 11, wiry and tougher than he should have had to be. "You're not like the cops," he said. I froze. "What do you mean?" "You listen." His words gutted me because that was all I'd ever wanted from my own father, and now somehow I was giving it away to a stranger's child. The small things grew. A professor at school encouraged me to apply for a grant, and with shaky hands I filled out the forms. When the funds came through, I used them to start a program: mentorship, tutoring, hot meals. I called it the Reeves Foundation, though I never told anyone it was for him. Our mission statement was simple: every kid deserves someone who sees them. And as the months passed, I realized I was finally beginning to see myself too. Not as the boy who hated his father, not as the young man who spit out words he could never take back, but as someone still capable of building something good from the ruins. On the first anniversary of his death, we held a small event at the youth center. Kids played ball outside. Parents shared coffee and pie inside. A few of Dad's old colleagues came by, dressed not in uniform but in plain clothes as if they wanted to blend in to belong. I stood at the front, badge in my pocket, notebook in my hand. I read one of his lines aloud to the group: "If I can walk away leaving someone with a little more dignity than they had when I arrived, then I've done my job." The room was silent. Then slowly people nodded. And for the first time I felt like I was carrying his torch, not by imitating him, but by finally learning the language of his love and speaking it out loud. That night I went home and placed his badge beside my bed. "Dad," I whispered into the dark, "I'm still angry. I'm still sad. But I'm trying." And in the silence that followed, I felt something I hadn't in years: peace. Open book chapter 16, What Remains After Goodbye. A year had passed. The town felt different without him, and yet in some ways he was everywhere. In the youth center walls painted fresh. In the laughter of kids playing ball on Saturdays. In the folded notebook pages I still carried with me, worn soft from my hands. Mom asked me once if I ever regretted the words I said that night at dinner. Every day, I told her. But regret was only half the story. The other half was what I chose to do with it. One evening, standing in front of the community we had built, kids, parents, neighbors, even a few officers who came without their uniforms, I finally spoke the words I never had the courage to say when he was alive. "My father was not perfect," I began, voice trembling. "He was quiet, stubborn, hard to read. There were years I mistook that silence for absence. Years I thought his badge meant he chose the world over me. But now I see. The badge wasn't a wall between us. It was the way he loved. He didn't always say the words, but he carried us, me, my mom, this town, in every long night, every risk, every choice to stand between danger and the people who needed safety." I didn't get to tell him this in time, but I will say it now. Dad, I see you, I understand, and I'm proud to be your son. The room was quiet, no applause, no murmurs, just silence, the kind of silence that heals, not wounds. When I stepped down, I felt lighter, like I had finally set something down I'd been carrying for years, because grief doesn't end. It softens, it teaches. And if you let it, it transforms into something else, gratitude. And that, I realized, was what remained after goodbye. Thank you for listening to this story. If it touched your heart, remember that love in a family comes in many forms, sometimes in gentle words and sometimes in quiet presence. I wish you and your loved ones good health, peace, and true happiness in every ordinary moment of life. Cherish your family, even in silence, because sometimes that too is a way of saying I love you.